Today, I want to talk to you about one of the board's most important committees. It's the committee that's responsible for ensuring stability, continuity, and performance for a strong and aligned nonprofit. I am talking about the Executive Director Evaluation and Compensation Committee. What I want to specifically talk about today are the five of the key responsibilities of this committee. The first committee responsibility is providing oversight for the executive director. What this means for the committee, it means establishing the accountability framework. This is usually done in collaboration with the executive director. What's an accountability framework? It's a governance tool. It can also, of course, be a management tool for your executive director, where the board will input what their expectations are for the executive director. In the accountability framework, the board should include things such as strategic and operational results, key goals for said operational and strategic results, and so on and so forth. When you think about accountability framework, you should think of what are the board's expectation towards the executive director with the performance lens, right? So operational performance and strategic performance. In its oversight role, the committee is also responsible for ensuring the maintenance of the strategic and operational results dashboard. In order to have an effective monitoring of strategic and operational results, there's a tool for that. And the most effective one that we've seen is by far a dashboard. So it therefore becomes the committee's role, in its oversight role of the executive director, of making sure that there is a strategic and operational results dashboard. It is the committee's work, or one of the committee's jobs, is to define the reporting framework. Not only is the committee responsible for proposing an accountability framework to the board, committee should also be ensuring that there's a results dashboard, and the committee should also be defining the reporting framework. How often will the executive director report on strategic results? How often will the executive director report on operational results? Is it quarterly? Is it a semestral reporting? Are there some results that are presented quarterly and others annually, for example? All that to say that this is also an important job of the Evaluation and Compensation Committee in its oversight function of the executive director. The second job, if I can say it that way, of the Compensation and Evaluation Committee is evaluating the executive director. This means annually assessing the executive director's performance in relation to the strategic framework, in relation to operational improvements, or the operational improvements framework, and operational standards. It is typically this committee's job to oversee as well the evaluation of the internal climate and employee satisfaction. That is often something that is included in the executive director's accountability framework, which I talked about in the previous slide. So in this slide, what we're saying here, what the main takeaway would be for the committee is that it's your job to oversee the director's annual performance review and determining what you're going to be evaluating the executive director on. So strategic results, operational results, and also getting data on employee satisfaction and internal climate data. So how is the organization doing in its culture of collaboration? There should be at least annual reporting to the board on this. And this is something that the committee should be keeping an eye on in its evaluation function. The third role for the Compensation and Evaluation Committee is ensuring fair compensation for the executive director. This means usually for the committee to develop a compensation policy that considers sector standards. What on average is the remuneration for an executive director for an organization in your sector, of your size, maybe budget-wise, and of your size employee-wise? And this compensation policy should also factor the organization's financial capacity. And it should also emphasize individual performance. Based on the executive director's performance, her total compensation can be up to such and such an amount. This information, these details, it's a good idea to detail them into this policy. And in terms of the committee's role of ensuring fair compensation, it would also be one of the responsibilities of said committee to propose and approve adjustments to base salary, performance bonuses, and other benefits based on achieved results. So there should be reflection or discussion at this committee about, well, if executive director reaches X amount of results, up to X amount of performance, up to X amount of percentage, what does that mean for a bonus, or what does that mean for total compensation, etc. These are usually the types of elements that are featured in a compensation policy for an executive director. Another one of the committee's important roles is to manage the executive director's hiring process, which means on an ongoing basis, planning and identifying the organization's needs. Now, this is often done in collaboration with the executive director, or maybe I should put it this way. In an ideal scenario, this happens with the executive director. While you have an executive director in place, there's planning and identifying the organization's needs in case something happens to the ED, or if you are, for example, in an organization where the executive director has announced her retirement in maybe, I don't know, a year, 18 months, 2 years, there should be discussions at the committee level on, well, what are the organization's needs for our next ED, and this and that. It would also be the committee's job to conduct a recruitment process. So as soon as your organization is in a position of having to hire a new ED or replace an existing ED for retirement purposes or other purposes, would be the Evaluation and Compensations Committee's job to recruit the next executive director. And once that executive director has been recruited and is in place, it would be the committee's job to oversee the onboarding and provide ongoing support as needed. Now, again, in a perfect scenario, if you're dealing, for example, with an executive director who's retiring, there's a good chance that in the plan for replacing the executive director, there's probably room for having the previous executive director work with the new executive director in a transitional process. That being said, I understand this is ideal. You could be in a situation, though, where you're replacing your executive director in an emergency setting or on a not expected basis. And in that scenario, well, there might not be the outgoing executive director who is there to oversee onboarding and provide ongoing support. In that case, the committee would be stepping in. So managing the executive director hiring process is also one important job of the Evaluation and Compensation Committee. The committee is also responsible for ensuring succession and emergency replacement plans for the executive director. So there is a role for this committee to ensure ongoing succession planning, which means identify internal and external talent with the potential to fill in the executive director's role should it be necessary. There's a role here for the committee to maintain an emergency replacement plan with key information. If your executive director would leave suddenly tomorrow, the question here that I'm inviting you and your committee to ask itself is, are we ready to replace the executive director on the spur of the moment type of thing. Is there a set of documents somewhere? Are these documents easy to find? Does anyone know where they are? And it can be simple things like who can access the building and when. And this might sound very banal, but these are all things that should be part of an emergency replacement plan in case your executive director leaves suddenly. And then either you're in a succession planning framework or you are in an emergency replacement framework. The name of the game here is ensure update of these plans, right? Making sure that your succession plans and replacement plans for the executive director are up to date. Make sure they reflect organizational changes. Make sure that these plans evolve as the organization grows and as different situations can arise. So I'm going to move on now with a few pitfalls, risks, tips, and impact. So the first pitfall when you're thinking about the compensation and evaluation committee's job is to confuse oversight with micromanagement. If the committee slips into micromanagement, the risk here is undermining the executive director's autonomy, which can create frustration and eventually erode trust between the executive director and the committee and probably the board. The tip that I have for you here is focus on monitoring results rather than focusing on the execution. Focus on the what rather than the how. What is the executive director doing in terms of achieving results and realizing the mission rather than the how is she doing it? The impact of oversight versus micromanagement is it usually gives for a strong sense of trust between the committee, the board, and the executive director, and also high degrees of collaboration between the board and the executive director via, of course, the committee and its work. The other pitfall here is evaluating the executive director without clear criteria. So the risk here is to have a performance evaluation that's maybe a bit more subjective, perhaps biased, and it can also lead to a lack of benchmarks for continuous improvement. So having clear criteria set in advance for evaluating your executive director will allow you to foster a culture of continuous improvement and long-term strategic alignment. And the way the committee, the board can do this is by establishing performance indicators which are aligned with the mission and the strategic vision. So you'd have strategic indicators and operational indicators. The next pitfall here is setting the executive director's compensation without a fair framework. The risk here is misaligning compensation and the organization's financial capacity, or misalignment between the executive director's performance and their level of remuneration. The tip here is to develop a compensation policy that, as I mentioned previously, that is based on sector benchmarks and maintain a balance between performance recognition and the organization's financial sustainability. The impact here is you ensure motivation by fairly compensating your executive director based on sector standards and based on your organization's capacity to pay. It ensures motivation and engagement of your executive director while maintaining your organization's financial stability. And last but not least, failing to plan for the executive director's succession can lead to instability and loss of direction in the event of a sudden departure. By failing to plan for the ED's succession, you could have a negative impact on the organization. What I'm trying to say here, of course, is the organization could be negatively impacted. The tip here, as I've said previously, is to establish a formal and evolving succession plan that identifies and develops internal or external talent when necessary. The impact of doing this is you ensure a smooth transition and you minimize the impact of leadership changes on the organization's stability and on its capacity to offer continuous programs and services.